Welcome to the Matt Cuda Photography Podcast, a podcast that explores nature and wildlife photography in your own backyard and throughout the United States. Okay, welcome back to the podcast. In this episode, episode 8, I'm going to take an in-depth look at the Sigma 150 to 600 f5 to 6.3 contemporary lens. We're going to look at the pros and cons of this lens and actually sample images that I obtained in the field with this lens. The object is really to give you a real-life review and let you draw your own conclusions as to whether or not this is a good investment. I want to just take a brief moment to apologize for getting this episode so late to you. That was not my intention. I went through the typical winter viruses, and I'm back at almost 100% now, so sorry about that. I'll try not to do that in the future. I also want to thank all you folks out there that have started listening to this podcast. I really appreciate it. There's been quite a few new people listening, and that encourages me. Like I said, I'm not out here to make a lot of money. I'm not out here to be a Canon fanboy or a Nikon fanboy or a Sigma fanboy. I'm just out here trying to help people and help the photography community. So let me just start by saying that this was a big purchase for me. The Sigma 150 to 600 contemporary was something that I thought about for a long period of time. It was something that I read a lot of reviews about prior to purchasing the lens. It was really an important decision for me. And it came down to this lens versus the Tamron 150 to 600. And honestly, the only two reasons that I went with it was one, and we're going to get into this later, but one, it had a docking station where you could download firmware updates to it, and two, I like the ability to customize it. You could really customize this lens. And so that was a big winner for me. And I guess a distant third, I really liked it from the perspective that it was a Sigma name, which I really endorse Sigma at this point. Okay, let's go through this lens. I've got it sitting here on the table next to me. Let's go through the pros and the cons. I did a brief review of this lens out there on, I'll put it in the show notes, a brief overview of this lens and what I thought of it a couple months ago. I've had more opportunity to shoot with it, and so I think I'm ready to really give this thing a once-over and let you know what I think. First of all, let me just say that there are three lines within Sigma, if you don't know. There's a contemporary line, which is, I guess, really prosumer kind of line, sometimes even consumer-type lenses. There is the art line, which is basically a bunch of really high-end fixed focal length lenses that are just superb image quality, have superb image quality. And there's finally the sport variants. And what they are, those lenses are designed for just what they say. Sports, professional photographers that need full weather sealing, the ultimate image quality, but they come at a price, and one of those prices is they oftentimes are heavier. So that's kind of how Sigma breaks up their line. It's kind of confusing at first until you do a little reading on it. The contemporary line is an affordable line, and that's important to me, as I'm sure it is to others listening to this. Let's just go through the lens. I'm going to take it from stem to stern, and I'm just going to go through what I like and don't like about it. First of all, the build quality of the lens. And I actually have this lens in my hands here. I'm just going to go through it. It has a very solid feel to it. It feels comfortable. It is a little heavy, but that's to be expected with a lens that has a focal length from 150 to 600 millimeters. It has a very smooth zoom ring on it. I have no problems at all with the zoom on this. It has a locking mechanism where I can lock the zoom at various focal lengths. It has a soft lock at 150, 200, 300. Let me verify that to make sure. Yep, it's got a soft lock. I really don't use the soft lock feature, but it is available. And what soft lock means is just you can lock it in place, say at 600, and I can easily just turn the zoom ring and unlocks it. A hard lock is done at 150, and I cannot turn the ring and unlock it by doing that. I have to physically slide the lock button to unlock it. So that helps you basically to keep the zoom creep from coming in, which is if I turn the lens upside down, sometimes you'll get zoom creep. It'll just slowly fall until it extends to 600 millimeters, and that could be a problem in the field. Honestly, with this lens so far, I've not seen that. I've not seen that happen. It has a nice, sturdy lens hood. I like it. It's not metal. It's just a plastic lens hood. It has some grooves inside the lens hood to keep glare down. It's just a good solid lens hood. I can't complain. Moving down the lens there's a focus ring for manual focus. I'm not a big fan of this ring. I'll be completely honest with you. It is a very small ring. It's hard to actually turn it when you need to in the field. Manual focusing can be a bit of a challenge, so that's definitely a con. It does have quite a bit of weather sealing. This is not a fully weather sealed lens, but if you were to take a look at the mount area on it, it's clearly got a nice rubber O-ring there that will keep water from entering your camera. So let's say I'm shooting my 1 series, which is a weather sealed camera. If I had this mounted to my 1 series and I dropped it in some water or something like that for a brief little bit, it's not going to get water down into the camera body itself. You might lose your lens, but you're not going to lose your $5,000 body. So flipping the lens over, I'm looking now at the controls for the lens. It has a focus switch at the top. You can set to autofocus. You can set to manual override so that you can override the autofocus anytime you want with a manual focus. And you have a manual focus switch, which completely disengages the autofocus. Moving down, it has a focus limiter switch, which is to be expected on any long focal length. Full is the first selector, and full simply means that it's going to focus from its minimum focusing distance to infinity. And the next notch is 10 meters to infinity, and that means that anything closer than 10 meters, it will not try to focus on, but anything greater, it will. Why is that a big deal? Okay, I just go into this real quick. When you're shooting birds in flight, 9 times out of 10, the bird is going to be beyond 10 meters. And so why make your autofocus rack focus less than 10 meters? It takes too much time. The idea is to limit focus so that your lens can focus faster. Okay. There is another switch as well, which is 2.8 meters to 10 meters, and that means that it's not going to focus beyond 10 meters. So if you're doing close-up work, why even have the autofocus go beyond 10 meters? It makes no sense. I leave mine on full most of the time. The only exception to that is when I do birds in flight, which I switch it over to the 10 meters to infinity. There are 2 OS modes, optical stabilization modes. The first mode is your general mode, which means that it will stabilize both the X and Y axis. The mode 2 is used for panning, so it stabilizes the Y axis. So when you're panning, that's important, right? You still want the blur of the X axis. And so you want that horizontal blur, but you don't want any vertical motion. So that's what that means. There's another switch which is very interesting on this lens. I have not had an opportunity to use it yet. I probably will do another podcast at some point on how to use the docking station and so on. But there is a docking station that you can purchase for this lens that will automatically download firmware updates to your lens. You just simply, it looks like a teleconverter, and you just attach it to the back of your lens, just like you would a camera or a teleconverter, and you can download updates just like you can for your camera. And the beauty of that is, let's suppose I bought this lens and I bought it in 2015. Well, let's say I buy a new camera 2 years from now that was never designed to work with this lens. Well, the idea is that Sigma will have updates available for that new camera. It will download it to your lens, and it will work much, much better. So definitely cool. Definitely a great feature with this lens. One of the biggest reasons I bought it. So definitely consider Sigma for that reason. They're the only ones out there doing it right now. I can't believe Canon and Nikon aren't doing it. I bet you, I wouldn't be surprised within the next 2 to 5 years that you see Tamron and one of the major manufacturers start doing that. It is a full frame. It is made for full frame cameras. You can use it on DX or APS-C crop cameras. One of the things I did want to mention that's important with this lens as a pro, and that is the full-time manual focus. I kind of briefly mentioned it a minute ago. I do use that. I don't use it all the time, but I do use it. And here's a perfect scenario where I would use that. Let's suppose I'm set up in my backyard birding studio. I'm pretty close to the birds, all right? I mean, if I make a move, they could be gone. What that full-time manual focus allows you to do, say you're in live view, you can reach up there and just subtly turn your manual focus ring while autofocus is engaged. Because there are times that for whatever reason, usually low contrast issues, you cannot achieve great focus with your lens. It happens to the best lenses and the best camera bodies. It's unusual, but it does happen. And you need to be ready to manually focus when that happens. And so that's why that's very important. The camera does support Sigma's teleconverters. You can shoot this with a 1.3x teleconverter, or 1.4, sorry, teleconverter with a 1 series body, or a 7D Mark II, or the new 80D, and you will have autofocus. So that is very cool. I have not tried it yet, but it's very cool. Realize that when you have a lens like this, too, this is another point. When you have a crop body, this lens becomes a 960 millimeter effective focal length. Now, you're not changing the focal length of the lens, but because you're using a crop camera, you essentially have a 960 millimeter crop. So this lens becomes a monster zoom lens. Another advantage, this lens is sharp. In my opinion, even at 600 millimeters, we're going to see that in a few minutes. Is it as sharp as a 600 millimeter Type 2 from Canon? No. Okay, no. It's just flat out not that sharp. Can you do a little work in post to make it look that sharp? You can get pretty close. If the conditions are right, you've got good contrast in the scene, you can bring out some pretty sharp details at 600 millimeters. I was very, very impressed. And some of the reports are that with a full frame camera, it's even better. So another advantage with this, it comes with a nice lens case. I mean, this is probably a $50 lens case that they throw in on this. And I really like that. I thought that was a lot better deal than the Tamron 150 to 600, which comes with no case. I got my first scratch on here, by the way. I'm very disturbed about that. But they do make lens covers for this, like lens coat, but they're pretty pricey. And when you start putting lens coats on your lenses, you have to start wondering, okay, is this cost effective? Because the thing only costs $900 anyway. So is it cost effective to put an expensive lens coat on it. I don't know. You can argue that both ways, I suppose. Probably the biggest pro that this lens has to offer, it doesn't cost $7,000, okay? It doesn't cost $10,000. Actually, I saw this on, originally it was $1,089, which is what I bought this for. I saw them on new ones on Amazon at less than $1,000. So that's pretty impressive. You're getting a lot of bang for your buck with this thing. You're gonna see the photos later, but I'm thoroughly impressed with what I've got here in my hands. This is a great lens. All right, so what's the cons? This thing can't be that, it can't be all that, right? Well, it's fairly heavy, which is to be expected. It's 4 pounds. Not as heavy as its bigger brother, which is 6 pounds. You got to be aware that Sigma makes a brother or sibling of this lens, or maybe this is the sibling. I don't know how you want to say it. Maybe the sport version that they make is the grandfather or father, but the sport version is much more rugged. It's completely waterproof. It weighs 6 pounds, making it very difficult to handhold. It's slightly sharper and slightly better autofocus, but that's very debatable at this point based on some of the studies that I've seen done with them. Another con is that when you're dealing with a 6.3 lens, autofocus is not going to be quite as good, and that's just the nature of the beast. What I recommend is if you require extremely fast autofocus, by all means buy a used 1D Mark II or 1D Mark III, which are fairly cheap on the market right now. And that autofocus will drive this lens beautifully. Believe me, I've done it. It works great. Highly recommend the 1 series with this lens. It's a good fit for it. But what else is a con? Here is probably the biggest con that I have with this lens. I didn't realize this until just a few weeks ago, and I have the photographs to prove it. Back years ago, Canon lenses could not be mounted on a tripod with optical stabilization engaged. What that meant was that if you happened to forget and leave optical stabilization on, or IS in the Canon world, if you left that on, you'd get back and your pictures would be all blurry. This is why I'm a huge proponent of focus checking. Always check your initial photographs for focus, because you don't want to get all the way back home and think, oh no, I left the OS on. Well, this lens has that problem. I did not realize this until I was about halfway through a shoot. What happened was I was photographing the elks, or the elk in Cataloochee here in North Carolina. I had a beautiful bull elk in front of me. He was in range. I was ripping shots. Started checking focus, and I couldn't figure out why everything was out of focus. And it looked like camera shake, and I could not put my finger on it. Well, come to find out, I was later on that day. I decided the bull elk had gone. It was getting pretty bright, and I decided to take a little detour and shoot some icicles. I had my camera and lens stabilized on a tripod, had OS engaged, took my first shot at a 15th of a second at about f/16, and lo and behold, they were completely out of focus due to, or completely blurred due to movement. And I could not figure this out for the life of me. I just sat there. I took another shot, same way. I said, oh, well, maybe it's the OS, because, older cameras had OS problems. Sure enough, I turned the OS off. Images came out perfectly, tack sharp. So I don't know yet if it's a problem just with this copy, or if the Sigma OS is just this way. I suspect it's the latter. I suspect that Sigma OS is a problem on when it's tripod mounted. Is this a deal breaker? No. Okay, it's not a deal breaker. We didn't have optical stabilization 15 years ago that was worth anything. You know, it still is available on the lens. It does work handheld. I have shots to prove that. So, no, I'm not upset. It's just that I wished I would have known that before I went out in the field with it. So I do not recommend at this point having optical stabilization on when shooting with a tripod. That's pretty much it for the cons. There's not a lot of cons with this lens. You're going to see a lot of people out there knocking it probably in the future. You're going to see people saying, no, you have to have a Canon, 100 to 402. It's the ultimate lens, blah, blah, blah. Be careful who you're listening to also. Now, there are some people out there that they just love Canon L lenses. That's perfectly fine. I love them too, actually. But it's funny. I was actually listening to a podcast about 2 or 3 weeks ago where a well-known photographer who is a Canon Explorer of Light, I'm not going to mention any names. No, it wasn't Artie Morris. It was someone else. If you go to their website and the gear that they use, they list only Canon products. Well, this guy let it slip that he was using the Tamron 150 to 600. And he was using it a lot. And I just thought that was very interesting. Why was he doing that? My guess is the zoom and the weight. The zoom on the Tamron and the Sigma is so versatile, I can't even begin to explain it to you. You just don't need the other lenses. You don't need them. If you have good lighting, a nice bright subject, good lighting, good day, you basically have a 200 millimeter lens built into this. You have a 300 millimeter lens built into this. You have a 400 millimeter lens built into this. You have a 500 millimeter lens built into this. And then you have the 600 millimeter lens built into this. All in one nice, neat package. And that's hard to beat. Let me tell you, when you're shooting a flock of birds, let's say you got a flock of wading birds out there, you might have some at 10 feet out, you might have some at 30 feet away, some at 50 feet away. Having that zoom lens to be able to switch to different birds that are doing different things can mean the difference between getting the shot and going home empty. I'm just saying, I like that about it, and other photographers are noticing it. So, don't feel bad about buying a non-L version. That's not a reason. Buying a lens that has L on it is not a reason to buy a lens. Buying a lens that works for you and your style is a reason to buy a lens. I love Artie Morris. He's a awesome photographer. He's in my top 5 that I follow. But he is just sold out to Canon. I mean, I know they're not necessarily paying him a salary per se, but I mean, he barely says anything bad about Canon. I've heard 1 or 2 comments from him knocking Canon. And that's okay. If that's your thing, if that's what makes you a better photographer, if that's what you need to make you a better photographer, go for it. I have no problem with it. As long as you're just not getting out there saying that you have to buy this lens or you're not going to be a good photographer. And I don't think Artie's doing that. Don't get me wrong. But there are those out there that do that on a regular basis. Okay, so that's my little rant there. I'm done with that. I'm going to switch gears here a little bit. We're going to actually look at some photographs. Before we do that, I just wanted to give a couple more tech specs that I forgot to mention. This lens has 20 elements and 14 groups. That's a lot of elements. That's one of the reasons that this has it is 4 pounds. It is the main reason is those lens elements in there. It's got a 9-blade aperture. Some of you are going to like that because that gives you a much smoother bokeh, especially if you're shooting into a backlit situation where you're going to see the round bokeh circles. They won't look hexagonal. They'll look more rounded. That's not a deal breaker for me. Some people, they really get into that. I forgot to mention the tripod collar on this. The tripod collar is removable. It's easy to remove. And the way they designed it is kind of interesting. You remove it, and there's a little rubber piece that actually fits over the gap that's created when you remove it. And it really makes it nice, somewhat weather tight, easier to maneuver in your hands. It's just a good addition, simple, cheap addition that Sigma put on this. It has a 95 millimeter filter size. Now, anybody that's listened to me in the past knows how I feel about filters, okay? I don't use them that much. I use a polarizer when I'm shooting waterfalls. I have been known on occasion to use a deep red filter for black and white work. I've used a warming filter in the past. I really don't use them anymore because post-production is so much better than it used to be. So, not a deal breaker for me. I don't care about the filter size. That's a waste of time for me. I kind of knocked the stabilization a little bit on this, and I just wanted to be clear that it doesn't have a bad optical stabilization. It has a good image stabilization. It does not have a great image stabilization. And like I said, maybe it's just the version of lens that I got. Maybe I just got a bad lens in that respect. I don't know. Okay, so let's move on to the photographs that I've taken with this lens. Actually, I've taken these photographs over the last 5 months that I've owned this lens. Multiple shoots, multiple big shoots, from down in Florida, into North Carolina, into my backyard, South Carolina beach. So I've given it a workout. There's no doubt about it. And if you go in the show notes, this is just a Flickr page that I set up that you can go to, and I'm just going to go right down through them and tell you what I like and don't like. The first image made my top images of 2015 for a couple reasons, but I don't really want to go into that right now. I just want to explain why I like this for what this lens can do. This guy here, this Anhinga, he was a cooperative subject, okay, and you'll get these every once in a while when you're out in the bush. But this Anhinga was not bothered by me at all. I could tell he was a Merritt Island regular. He was used to vehicles. He was used to people walking around. And also I got fairly close to him. This shot was 600 millimeters. And I've got the metadata out there for you too. I shot at 600, 1/500th of a second, ISO 400, f6.3. So here you are. Here is a 600 millimeter shot. You can see the quality. It's sharp. I can see the hairs the feathers very well on him. It is very shallow depth of field if you look at it. Actually, the end of his beak is actually out of focus, and his eye is in focus. So that's how shallow the depth of field here is. So just go ahead and remove those sites out there that you've read that said it's soft at 600. One of the reasons that you see people report this is because they don't know how to shoot a 600 millimeter lens. Some of these people that are out there on the internet bashing lenses, they don't know the first thing about shooting a 600 millimeter lens. And if you're not used to shooting long lenses, it's a learning curve, okay? First of all, you can't move. You got to be using proper hand holding technique. You got to have that left hand securely on top of the lens. And you got to be using good breathing techniques. Now in this case, I'm shooting at a 500th of a second, which is still fairly slow shutter speed for a 600 millimeter lens with an effective focal length of 960. You know, you're shooting on an 18 megapixel camera. You've got the distance between pixels affecting it. Effectively, you got a lot of problems with pixel density and so forth. So you got to know what you're doing with a 600 millimeter lens. It's no joke. You guys are out there that shoot these, you know. It's no joke to shoot a 600. You got to know what you're doing. Now, along those lines, real quick, I just wanted to add a little tip here. If you're shooting long lenses, high shutter speeds are your friend. Do not rely on optical stabilization unless you have to. If the situation will let you shoot at ISO 400, it'll let you get a thousandth of a second, go for it. The higher that shutter speed, the better your chances of success in general. So there it is, the Anhinga, 600 millimeters. That dispels that myth. Yes, there was some sharpening done here. Not a whole lot of sharpening on this image. This image was quite sharp coming out of the camera. Just wanted to add that. The next image is of an anhinga. Different anhinga, drying his wings here in the mangroves in Florida at Merritt Island. What you're going to see is this lens was shot at 403 millimeters. Now remember, I'm talking about the zoom again. How handy that zoom is to have. I can just shoot at 400 if I want to in this case. I'm shooting at 1/1000th of a second. Lots of shutter speed, plenty of fast shutter speed. And this guy is sharp. When you zoom into him, I got I got the a pretty large resolution image out there. You can zoom into this guy and see he's pretty sharp. At 400, it's sharp. Got no problems with this lens. I could sell this image tomorrow. Got no problem with it. Let's move on to the next image. Now this next image was taken at Huntington Beach, South Carolina with my 7D. And one thing I like about reflective birds like the great egret is how easy it is to get a high shutter speed with them because they have such bright plumage. I almost never have problems shooting the great egrets because of their reflective qualities. And in this case, you're seeing another 600 millimeter shot, ISO 250 at 1/2500th of a second. And this is, I believe this was shot roughly at 9:30 in the morning. So good lighting. Again, if you can get good lighting, that is so key to producing good images. I cannot emphasize that enough. But again, 600 millimeters, sharp, no problems. Okay, let's look at the next image. The next image was taken in my backyard about a month ago. It's of a mourning dove. Okay, I like mourning doves actually. I think they're a beautiful bird. I think they're kind of taken for granted, but they just have the most beautiful call, and they're just a gentle, beautiful bird. They are actually a game bird. People hunt these birds. I don't know why, but they do, and they're just a lovely subject. Don't let people. Again, I'm going to get on this rant here a little bit. Sorry, I've got to do it. Don't let people tell you that a common bird is not a good subject. This is probably one of the biggest lies that is perpetuated out there in the wildlife photography community. And don't take my word for it. Go ask Artie Morris. Go ask Moose Peterson. Should I photograph common species? They're going to say absolutely. 2 reasons. 1, you could get a great shot of that bird doing something unusual, which no one else has. 2, that bird might be extinct in 10 years. You don't know. So definitely shoot common species. Definitely. In this case, he made a good subject for testing. If we look at the specs here, this is kind of in the sweet spot of this lens. Personally, I feel like around 300 to 325 millimeters is the sweet spot of this lens. It's where everything comes tack sharp. Part of that is probably a little bit based on the fact that you don't need as high a shutter speed at 300 millimeters, and so you tend to get more sharp images. That said, I still think this is the sweet spot for this lens. This image shot ISO 320 at a 6/40th of a second. Tack sharp image. Beautiful subject. Again, the lens is phenomenal. I have no problems with this. Focused rapidly, got the shot. The next image was on the day I was just talking about this a few minutes ago with the OS stabilization issue. This shot was taken after I figured out that OS was causing my problems. This is not a particularly interesting shot. It's a shot of a cow elk, or an elk cow, I should say. But I put it in here to kind of show you again that sweet spot of this lens. This animal was sharp. It was sharp coming out. Very little sharpening done. Just what can I say? I mean, it's a sharp image, and that's what we're trying to do here: is show the quality that this lens can produce. Again, we're in the sweet spot at 302 millimeters, f5.6 at a 500th of a second. ISO 400. Overcast conditions, might I add. Okay, the next shot is of a blue jay on an overcast day. Again, we're there in that sweet spot at 300 millimeters, f5.6, a 6/40th of a second, spot on, sharp, good shot. What can I say? It's a great lens. There is one more shot in here that is kind of, it's probably one of my favorite shots, if not my favorite shot I've ever taken. It was shot with a 150-600 contemporary. It was shot at a very low shutter speed of 1/100th of a second, tripod mounted. And here's the kicker, guys. OS was engaged. And yet we do not have a blurry image. And so this is the shot that has me scratching my head and thinking maybe the OS is messed up on this lens a little bit. If that's the case, okay, fine, I'll live with it. But it does show you that at 600 millimeters, at even a low shutter speed of 1/100th of a second, tripod mounted, we got a good shot. Proper hand holding. Now with this shot, I'll be honest with you, I had to hold my breath. I had to have my hand rested on that lens, and I had to just slowly depress that shutter button. That is so important when you're using a low shutter speed with these lenses. So that's pretty much it. And, honestly, I can't recommend this lens enough. But realize that when you're shooting a lens that's this long, you have got to get your technique down. And if you listen to other photographers, it's just not me saying this. Long focal length lenses have a lot of baggage that comes with them. If you're used to shooting 50 millimeters and 100 millimeters and 200 millimeters, forget everything you learned. This baby takes some work. That said, this lens has been a game changer for me. I went from shooting a 300 millimeter Tamron, 70-300 Tamron, which was, by the way, a very good lens, to this focal length, and it changed everything. I was able to really see my vision. My vision for my style has always been, I like close shots with great impact, and that's what I'm looking for. And so for me, buying a 600 millimeter lens was a no-brainer, and that's exactly what I did. And my vision is becoming reality. And I'm not saying all that so you go out tomorrow and buy this lens. I'm just saying that it made all the difference in the world at a reasonable price. But that's about all I had for the review. Let's get into the next segment. And this next segment is something that, for those of you that follow this series, this is the Know Your Subject segment. Because I believe that, we've got to discuss the subjects that we're shooting, whether it be a bear or a bird of some kind. We got to know that subject. If we don't know the subject, then we're already going out there with one hand tied behind our backs, because we don't know what that guy's going to do. We don't know what that elk is going to do. We don't know what that black bear is going to do. We don't know if what this bird is going to do during mating season, or what this elk is going to do during the rut. We don't know because we haven't learned it. And that's what I'm trying to do here is open some channels to learning how our subjects behave. And this week we're going to talk about the North American elk. Okay, so that sound you just heard was actually the bull North American elk. According to the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, the cow, which is the female of the species, weighs 500 pounds, can stand as high as 4.5 feet at the shoulder. The bull, which is the male of the species, weighs 700 pounds and can stand as high as 5 feet at the shoulder. The colors of the elk differ throughout the year. In the summer, it has a copper brown tone. In the fall, winter, and spring, it's light tan. So, let's talk about how to photograph them and when's the best time and all that. I'll be very honest with you. The elk is something that's has really piqued my interest because we have a population in North Carolina now of elk that have been reintroduced. They are I believe, the Rocky Mountain variant of the elk, and they're doing very well here. We have a very strong population. Actually, they opened a hunting season on them. We have so many now, which is just, I just think that's the best thing that's ever happened in North Carolina wildlife, in my opinion. We used to have them here, of course, in the eastern United States. They went extinct due to overhunting and possibly just lack of food and predators and so forth. So we don't know all the details of why they went extinct. They just did many years ago, and now we're bringing elk back into North Carolina. Anyway, when is the time to shoot them? You can shoot elk anytime you want. They're always in the woods. The question you have to ask yourself is, what makes a good elk photograph? Well, I mean, there's the standard shots. You've got the elk bugling. Who hasn't seen the shot of the elk early morning bugling for the female elk, and you see the breath, the vapor coming out of his mouth from his breath in early morning. Beautiful shot. I mean, it's classic. That's one you can look for. There's elk attacking one another. It's very common at certain times of the year. We're going to talk about that in a second. There is, your typical portrait shots, like I took of the cow elk. There's environmental shots of the elk in a field against a mountain. Who hasn't seen those kind of photographs before? So there's a lot of images you can take, but the best time of year to photograph them is in the fall, during the rut. Now, for those of you that aren't hunters or know biology of the American elk, the rut is the time of year where they mate. Okay, and during that time, the bull elk is full of testosterone. I mean, he's like a teenager, like a boy teenager. I mean, he is just chasing down the female elk, and he will basically gather the cows and the calves into these small groups we actually call them harems, for obvious reasons. During this time, they'll bugle, they'll rub trees, shrubs. Though it's not uncommon to see an elk with like grass and stuff hanging from his antlers, where he's been rubbing his antlers. They're very aggressive during this time period, and a word of caution on that: they can be dangerous to photographers. There has been several injuries that I'm aware of due to elk charging. And use common sense out there. Do not approach an elk during the rut, especially. I would say do not approach them less than 30 feet, let's just say. And even then, it can be dangerous. I try to stay in my vehicle when I'm photographing elk anyway. It's a little safer. It's even more comfortable. And if you're going to a state park or a federal park, you're going to have pretty tame elk anyway, and so you're going to be relatively close to them. But this whole idea of the rut it's a key thing to remember. So let me just give you an example of the danger that these animals can present to you. There was an elk in Yellowstone, I believe, called Number 6. Look that up on YouTube sometime. Number 6 took out many vehicles. He charged vehicles. Actually was supposedly at one point had a tail light hanging from one of his antlers of a car he had just slammed into. He attacked 2 photographers that we know of. They both lived but were injured. So they are not to be messed with. Okay. That said, go ahead and photograph them. If you're doing it in a safe way, you're going to be okay. If you're really worried about it, find somebody that can take you. You can pay him whatever, take you out there, show you the ropes, so you can see firsthand how to handle their biology and their behavior. So that's pretty much it for the elk. there's a lot more, obviously, to their behavior and so forth. Go ahead and check out some of these websites on the internet. But I hope that kind of whets your appetite to learn more about them. Well, sadly, folks, that is the end of this episode. Again, thanks to everybody for listening. I've got some cool stuff coming up this year we're going to talk about. I got another trip to Florida coming up. I'm going to take you with me to via the podcast to St. Augustine Alligator Farm, which is a tremendous place for photographing wading birds. I'm going to be going to probably back to Huntington Beach this year for a small trip. Possibly going to head to Cades Cove this year during the rut. So like for whitetails, I want to get some good whitetail deer images. So do stay tuned. This is going to be a good year. It's going to be an action-packed year. And one thing you're not going to see that much is reviews, because I'm kind of on a I think we all need to do this once in a while, right? I'm on a equipment fast. So I'm not buying any new equipment that's not, unless something needs to be replaced, I'm not buying any new equipment for the next 2 years. So unless I rent something, which is possible, there won't be any more equipment reviews. But that's it. Thanks for listening. Make it a great day, and get out there and enjoy nature. Bye-bye. Music for this episode was provided by Dr. Turtle.